I never thought we were actually going to send the Abrams. Can I just emphasize, the Abrams felt like a distant possibility, and we have gotten literally the best case scenario happening right now for the Ukrainians. This is best case scenario. A big change in policy from not only Germany, but now the United States as well. Because I thought this is how it was going to go. I thought it was going to be that Germany approves the Leopards after having enough pressure put on them. The Leopard tanks, maybe they send a few, or maybe they allow the Poles and the Danish to send their Leopards, because there's over 2,000 Leopard tanks throughout Western Europe, owned by different countries within NATO. And so there's a really there's kind of like a high ceiling of the amount of tanks they can send over that are Leopard 2, when right now they're running out of T-72 tanks out of old Soviet stockpiles. They were able to get 20 out of Morocco, who got tanks from Belarus. Very funny, by the way, that Belarus sends Morocco tanks in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, and now those tanks are being sent to Ukraine to defend against an invasion that was partially launched from Belarus. Very funny how international relations works. But they're running out of those tanks. So I thought the Leopard 2 is the most reasonable option. It has a lighter logistical load than the Abrams, and that's why I thought that would be the tank that gets approved. Then we saw Olaf Scholz position himself and say, well, before I said that we would need to send tanks with others, and now that Poland's saying that they want to send the Leopard 2s, now our new position is that America has to send Abrams as well. And they moved the goalpost. That is true. But what I really wasn't expecting was for the United States to say, okay, we'll send the Abrams. The United States is going to be sending 31, you heard that right, 31 Abrams tanks over to Ukraine. And while they're sending over those 31 Abrams tanks, on top of that, the Germans have approved Leopard tank shipments. That means we're going to see Leopards coming from Poland, 14 Leopards in the first shipment from Poland. We're going to see Leopards coming from Denmark. We're probably going to be seeing tanks come from all throughout Europe, all throughout nations that use the Leopard.
Of Neptune gave Mock Drums a tier 1 subscription. Sorry, this is a no whites allowed site chat.
Jesus, no, that's not true. No white names, be clear. No white name, not no whites, no white names, because white names shows that you're not a sub. You got to be specific. The YouTube subs aren't going to understand that because they're not on Twitch. They're not in the site chat, okay? Thank you, Blue Rider, for the gifted, though. Anyway, let's read the story, and I want to actually watch the conference, the Biden conference, where he announces this. And I want to talk about the impact that these tanks are going to have in the war, because they are going to have an immense impact. You see a lot of people right now downplaying how useful the Leopard tank shipments, which now, I mean, they have a really high cap for the amount of Leopards they could send over if this goes successfully. We see a lot of people downplaying, like Jackson Hinkle and others. I saw him, he posted a video like, oh, you think that the Abrams is going to help? Well, here's a video of an Abrams exploding, as if, like, people were making the claim that the Abrams was invincible. I mean, how much coat mode do you have to be in where your argument in favor of Russia, like, oh, this is not a big deal, is, well, those tanks are literally not indestructible. No tank is indestructible. No military vehicle in the world is indestructible. What an insane standard to be like, oh, this is only going to have an effect if the tanks are literally indestructible. But anyway, let's read the Washington Post story before hearing Biden, who made a speech about why he was sending the tanks and why he doesn't think it's going to lead to an escalation. And I also want to talk about that because I saw Michael Tracy and I saw a lot of others saying, oh God, why are people so excited that the Germans, the first time since World War II, has their armor charging across Europe, as if they're like painting a picture as if Germany is like trying to take Moscow again. I want to talk about how people have been painting this delivery. But first, let's read the article. Let's get a basis to what we're talking about. U.S. will supply M1 tanks to Ukraine as Germany approves Leopards. The Biden administration announced Wednesday that it will send 31 of its premier battle tanks to Ukraine following agreement with Germany to deliver scores of its Leopard 2 tanks from across Europe. This means Denmark, this means Poland, probably Germany, like all these different countries that have asked to send tanks. And I'm only naming a few. There are others that are also actively trying to send tanks, not only Leopards, but T-72s as well, like we just talked about with Morocco. The decisions end months of debate among Western allies and paved the way for a major shift in the balance of power on the Ukrainian battlefield. President Biden said after morning calls with European leaders that a decision belied Russian President Vladimir Putin's belief that the West would eventually tire out of its commitment to Ukraine and break up their coalition. So this is the first thing I want to say. Originally, and this was the plan that everybody was openly discussing, if you go to the Russia supporters in the West, like Gonzalo Lira, he was saying that this time next year, you know, bread would cost 7 times what it costs now. There'd be rolling blackouts. The economy would be in shambles. Sorry for that sound. The economy would be in shambles. There'd be riots and governments would be getting overthrown and all this nonsense. He was making all these predictions, and the Russia was kind of like banking upon some of these predictions coming true. The idea that Ukraine supporting it would be too much for these powers as they're strangled by the lack of Russian energy, and eventually they cave. But instead of this energy disaster that the Russians predicted, the Europeans, while prices went up, largely avoided the worst case scenarios that the Russians were banking on for the winter to make the Europeans cave in their support. Now it's January. We're going into February, March, winter's ending. We're headed towards spring. And not only is the West not caving, not only is our economy's not in shambles as Biden's creating new jobs and our economy's actually recovering from the COVID recession and everything else, as our economy continues to pick up steam, as energy prices continue to go down, and Biden's approval rating continues to go up, and it's nearing actually meeting the 50% mark, which it hasn't hit since the beginning of his presidency, way before this war. As that continues to develop, the Russians can no longer bank on this winter making the Europeans cave, which was the strategy. And I assume that behind closed doors, when they were talking to, you know, people in the Russian establishment, oligarchs, stuff like that, a lot of noise was made about winter. And the Europeans were really afraid that it would be too much for them, but it wasn't. And the Russians really bet a lot on this. I mean, you could check the bombardments during the wintertime against the energy grid. When I was in Kharkiv, I saw myself, when the strikes would happen a mile away from me against the energy grid, trying to knock out the energy so people would freeze. They were doing this continuously during the winter, hoping to break the spirit of the Ukrainians through making them freeze and causing an electricity crisis, and through the Europeans by causing just a general energy crisis through a lack of Russian energy. That did not work. The spirit of the Ukrainians didn't go down, and they didn't smash, they didn't go away. The Ukrainians are more determined to win than ever, and the Europeans are not in an economic crisis to the point where they're having rolling blackouts and they can't choose anything but to cave to Russian demands. That's not happening. The West is doubling down in their support to Ukraine, and they're sending more aid than ever. So first things first, I want to talk about that statement this article made about Putin's administration, like this idea that they were going to make the West cave through an economic stranglehold and breaking the spirit of the Ukrainian people. If that is what Putin told oligarchs, which I have good reason to believe since they were betting on that strategy, as you can see from their air campaign,
a curd is a curd.
They're going to be walking away from this.
Unasis has donated $5.
Thank you so much for the YouTube link. I might watch that after I'm done with the segment. Thank you so much for the $5. Link that later. What those oligarchs are going to be thinking is, wow, it seems like the Europeans are more determined than ever to support Ukraine. We haven't captured all the Donbass like we said we would. We haven't overthrown the Zelensky regime. We have lost over 50%. We're calling it the regime because it's from their perspective. We've lost over 50% of the land we've captured since February 24th. We've lost how many countless casualties? Our economy is worse for wear. It's not doing too good right now. The Russian economy has a lot of planes grounded because they can't import new parts. Their train system is struggling. Their logistics are struggling. The average Russian is in a worse state economically than they were from before the war. Hundreds of thousands of Russians are fleeing the country, not only to avoid being drafted, but also to get their jobs, which have fled the country because all these Western companies have fled due to the sanctions, due to the fact that many of them have been pressured socially to leave Russia, to stop supporting the Russian economy, which its functioning, its productivity helps the war effort. We see the Russians having used tampons to plug up wounds in battle. I remember I talked about that. I talked about that problem when there was a discussion between a soldier who was training soldiers and telling them what they needed to bring to Ukraine, and they brought up tampons instead of medical gauze if they can't buy any because the local soldiers couldn't because they were all out, or they were way too expensive and they were being scalped on the internet because, like, the 1.5 million winter uniforms disappeared. You can assume the same thing probably happened with medical gear. We've actually found soldiers in the field in Ukraine with tampons. Tampons that were going to be used to plug up bullet wounds. But obviously they did not work because we found them on their bodies, meaning it was not that effective. Anyway, that strategy, if that is what Putin and his administration was telling his people, that don't worry, the Europeans are going to cave once the economy really starts to crumble around them due to our energy blockade, our energy not going to them, that argument no longer valid, because we've been through winter, the Europeans have been through the worst of it, and they're on the other side of it, ready to support Ukraine more. Same with the United States. So if that was the argument Putin was making behind closed doors to oligarchs, those oligarchs are going to be thinking, now what? We're going to see American tanks being used by the Ukrainians. And these tanks, while they have a logistical heavy load, these tanks are better than the T-72s the Russians are using. They just are. They're going to be logistically heavy, but they're better tanks. And the Leopards are coming, which has a much larger amount to pull from. They can send a ton of Leopards. They're logistically not as heavy as the Abrams. What are they going to be thinking? They're going to be thinking that it looks like they're not caving. We're in for the long haul. Can we win the long haul as Western armor, which is necessary for a Ukrainian counteroffensive to take Mariupol or a lot of other locations, Zaporozhye being the one that everybody has their eye on because that seems like the most logical next step. Are they prepared to wait that out for hopefully a break in the line? Will they be able to stop this swarm of Western armor that's going to be coming over on Ukraine's side in doing these offensives? Those oligarchs are going to really start considering their options. I'm not saying they're going to overthrow Putin, but I am saying that they're probably more nervous than ever since the start of this war, since that strategy of just making the West cave, it has failed. It has failed. It has failed in making the West cave. It has failed in making their populations cave. And it has failed in making Ukraine cave. We are totally and fully, completely united, Biden said in a brief address at the White House. Today's announcement builds on the hard work and commitment of countries around the world that what this is about, helping Ukraine defend and protect Ukrainian land. If Russian troops return to Russia where they belong, he said, this war would be over today. But Western unity has been undeniably strained over the last several weeks as Germany refused to approve sending the tanks that Ukraine had requested or to authorize other countries and also field Leopards to transfer theirs, unless the United States would agree to send its M1 Abrams. Again, it was a goalpost move, but it seems that it's resulted in an even better outcome. The Defense Department had long insisted that Abrams tanks were too complex for transfer and use by the Ukrainians. Obviously, it seems that their opinion has changed and they're sending the tanks. Ico Rich, thank you for the tier 1. How long does it take to make a new Abrams though? I have no clue how long it takes to make an Abrams. I wish I knew, but I am not a tank expert and I am not an engineer. You can probably Google that though. Biden congratulated German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, saying that Germany has really stepped up. Berlin didn't force me to change our mind, he said. We wanted to make sure we're all together. I think to some degree, they probably were like, look, if I'm doing this, you got to do it with me. So to a degree, I think they did change their mind, even if they're saying they didn't. The debate was eventually resolved with a compromise. The U.S. tanks to be purchased from manufacturers rather than transferred from existing American military stockpiles will not arrive for months, if not years. American officials have emphasized that the M1s are part of a long-range planning for Ukraine's armed forces rather than weapons that will be put into immediate use. So this is long-term American thinking. This is, we're in the struggle for if it lasts a year or if it lasts years. Years. And I also want to say, we have so many of these tanks in reserve and military stockpiles. I would not be that surprised if we just straight up sent some from our military stockpiles, and I wouldn't even be that concerned if we did so, because we have a ton of tanks just literally lying in the desert made by these manufacturers, and they're not being used anywhere. And so I don't think it would be that bad if we actually took it from existing stockpiles. But a lot of people like Josh Hawley are very, very critical of the amount of aid we're sending to Ukraine, not from the perspective of, oh, if we send weapons to Ukraine, they're evil, but from the perspective of, hey, we should be sending these weapons to Taiwan. And I think this might be in a way to appeal to that type of criticism that we will still have enough weapons to support Taiwan, ourselves, and Ukraine if we rely on manufacturers instead of stockpiles. That's at least what I kind of read this as. The plan is to transfer the Leopards, currently spread across Europe, in time for Ukraine to defend against an anticipated Russian offensive in spring and to launch its own counteroffensive. In Europe, the goal is to quickly assemble 2 Leopard tank battalions, equivalent to at least 70 tanks. As a first step, Germany will provide a company of 14 Leopard 2 A6 tanks from its army stocks, the government in Berlin said in a statement. European allies will also provide tanks with German approval. Poland, Denmark, you get the idea. German Ministry of Defense said it aims for the tanks to be on the battlefield by the end of March. That's actually very soon. I mean, we're almost through January. That means basically a month and a half away. They're going to have these tanks there. That leaves a tight window for logistics and training, which is expected to begin within days. Damn, they are speeding this up. Makes sense that this is going to take a lot more time for the Abrams to get there due to its logistically heavy load. It's going to need more training, and it's more long-term thinking. In Washington, officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to brief reporters said the Abrams tanks will be paid for with the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. This is the same thing I think should be paying for the Starlink services, which I'm going to release a video on my main channel very soon. The video's finished. We're just trying to come up with a good thumbnail. A pot of money typically used to purchase military equipment for Ukraine, the United States does not have readily available. It was not immediately clear why the Biden administration decided to purchase new tanks for Ukraine rather than sending some of the thousands that are already in the U.S. military inventory. Again, I would be perfectly fine with doing that, although officials denied that the military had any excess tanks. We do. The U.S. plans a call for sending 31 tanks to Ukraine, enough for 1 battalion, one of the administration officials said. Could you imagine how weird it would be if you found out you're a Ukrainian tanker and you are going to be one of the few tankers that gets to drive an Abrams, which is going to be basically the most high-tech tank the Ukrainians have, the best tank the Ukrainians have, the most logistically heavy tank the Ukrainians have? That must be a really weird feeling to be one of 31 crews manning one of these tanks. That's got to be wild. The administration also said we'll send 8 M88 armored recovery vehicles designed to tow and repair tanks. They will require additional training, both in terms of learning to operate and maintain the Abrams and incorporating the vehicles into offensive operations with other weapons, the administration official said. The training will occur outside of Ukraine, one administration official said, without specifying where. One possibility might be the, oh my god, Germany. Okay, Grafenwohr, however you say it, training area in Germany, the largest UN installation of its kind in Europe. This month, the U.S. Army began training a battalion of more than 600 Ukrainian troops there on how to combine artillery, fighting vehicles, and other weapons to maximize the damage they can cause. Combined arms warfare, basically. Asked whether the Germans made it a precondition that the United States commit tanks before they would send theirs, the officials declined to answer directly. So the answer is yes. The decisions reached came from an iterative conversation, one said. Okay, so that's enough of that. You can see here like a graph of the 2 tanks, the Abrams, the Leopards 2. These are going to be very, very, very good tanks for the Ukrainians. Anyway, I want to move on to President Biden's speech about sending the Abrams, because he gave a short 9.5-minute speech about why he decided to send these tanks, why he thinks it's not a danger of escalation. And I do want to talk about the matter of escalation, because I was going, I was kind of going back and forth. Well, not really back and forth. I was more just criticizing Michael Tracy over this issue on Twitter and others. Because this idea of escalation around sending tanks, I don't really understand it. But first, let's listen to President Biden as he gives this historic speech about something that could be a breakthrough for the Ukrainians.
Courage and the indomitable determination to live free. Of their courage and the indomitable determination to live free. And through every single step of this horrific war, the American...
Is there a louder speech that we can listen to? Can we, maybe The Guardian?
The United States has worked...
There we go. That's better. That is better.
Burns is an immoral,
morally corrupt, bankrupt man. No matter. Thank you so much for the Prime being sub for 9 months. I appreciate that, buddy. Drop your only Prime here. I appreciate it.
Almost morning. It's actually noon. Thank you for being here. Yesterday marked 11 months since Russia's brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 11 months in which the Ukrainian people have showed Putin and the world the full force of their courage and the indomitable determination to live free. And through every single step of this horrific war, the American people have been strong and unwavering in their support, and Democrats and Republicans in Congress have stood together. The United States has worked in lockstep with our allies and partners around the world to make sure the Ukrainian people are in the strongest possible position to defend their nation, their families, and against the truly brutal aggression of Russia. I haven't seen the likes of this in a long time. The United States and Europe are fully united. This morning, I had a long conversation with our NATO allies, German Chancellor Scholz, French President Macron, Prime Minister Sunak, and the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, to continue our close coordination and our full support of Ukraine.
I'm sorry to interrupt Biden, but this just hit me. In one hand, I see a lot of the pro-Russia crowd responding to this, not only extremely angry, which we're going to look at the angry response from Russian state TV. Dude, they are pissed. But on one hand, I hear from these guys like, this is a massive escalation. This is insane. You've brought the world closer to the end of times. The world, if you said the world could explode. And on the other hand, they're saying these tanks are garbage. They won't do anything. They're all going to explode. They're not invincible, like blah, blah, blah. So on one hand, it's like these tanks are worthless. But on the other hand, they're the biggest escalation in the world. They can't even get the narrative straight on how to respond to these deliveries. But let's continue.
Because you all know I've been saying this for a long time. The expectation on the part of Russia is we're going to break up. We're not going to stay united.
Can I also say, this makes it funnier than anything else. It's Zelensky's birthday today. It's Zelensky's 45th birthday today. It's like a birthday gift. It's like a birthday gift. You couldn't find a better day to create the level of cope that we're seeing.
But we are fully, thoroughly, totally united. With spring approaching, Ukrainian forces are working to defend the territory they hold and preparing for additional counteroffensives. To liberate their land, they need to be able to counter Russia's evolving tactics and strategy on the battlefield in the very near term. They need to improve their ability to maneuver on open terrain, and they need an enduring capability to deter and defend against Russian aggression over the long term. The Secretary of State and the Secretary of the military behind me they've been deeply involved in this whole effort. Armored capability, as General Austin will tell you, has been critical, and that's why the United States has committed hundreds of armored fighting vehicles to date, including more than 500 as part of the assistance package we announced last Friday. And today I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion.
Whoa!
Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives.
Yeah, boy!
The Abrams tanks are the most capable tanks in the world.
Yeah, they are,
They're
baby.
also extremely complex to operate and maintain. So we're also giving Ukraine the parts and equipment necessary to effectively sustain these tanks on the battlefield.
He's talking about the equipment needed to recover them to tow vehicles, so if they get damaged, they can repair them. And of course, the training necessary to operate these tanks since they're very logistically heavy. And again, one of the most complex tanks in the world. Did you know it actually, I believe in some of the tanks, I don't know if it's in all Abrams, they actually have like a speaker system where you can like hook up your MP3 player and play music. Oh my gosh, what a wild tank. I remember people during Desert Storm or it was Operation Iraqi Freedom, one of the two, they actually could hook up their MP3 player. Does people know this? Do you guys know this? I don't know if this is a well-known fact. MP3 player, Abrams tank. It's not coming up, but I could have sworn I was watching a bunch of like just like personally recorded footage, like some kind of gonzo stuff from just soldiers during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and they were talking about it.
And we'll begin to train the Ukrainian troops on these issues of.
It was Desert Storm? Okay. Gotcha. It wasn't Desert Storm. I know it was after we invaded and deposed Saddam. It was after that, around that time. I think during like during the occupation.
Sustainment, logistics, and maintenance as soon as possible. Delivering these tanks to the field is going to take time. Time that we'll use to make sure the Ukrainians are fully prepared to integrate the Abrams tanks into their defenses. We're also closely coordinated this announcement with our allies. The American contribution will be joined by an additional announcement, including that will be readily available and more easily integrated for use in the battlefield in the coming weeks and months from other countries. I'm grateful to Chancellor Scholz for providing German Leopard 2 tanks and will lead an effort to organize a European contribution of 2 tank battalions for Ukraine. I want to thank the Chancellor for his leadership and his steadfast commitment to our collective efforts to support Ukraine. Germany has really stepped up. The Chancellor has been a strong voice for unity, a close friend, and for the level of effort we're going to continue. Supporting Ukraine's ability to fight off Russian aggression to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity is a worldwide commitment. Not just look, it's a worldwide commitment. Last week, in Germany, Secretary Austin convened the Ukraine Defense Contact Group for the 8th time. This group is made up of some 50 nations, each making significant contributions of their own to Ukraine's integrity. Each fully committed to making Ukraine remain strong and independent and able to defend itself against Russian threats and violence. I want to thank every member of that coalition for continuing to step up. The UK, the United Kingdom, recently announced that it's donating Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. France
I didn't even talk about that. The French aren't sending actual tanks. They're sending like light armor vehicles or whatever. But the British are also sending tanks. Dude, the amount of it's like we've been asking for these tanks for the entirety of the war, and then they all just come in a wave coordinated with each other. It's you know, it's just like the West. Always waits the last possible moment to come in and try to save the day.
AMX-10s, armored fighting vehicles. In addition to the Leopard tanks, Germany, like the United States, Germany is also sending a Patriot missile battery. The Netherlands is donating a Patriot missile and launchers. France, Canada, the UK, Slovakia, Norway, and others have all donated critical air defense systems to help secure Ukrainian skies and save the lives of innocent civilians who are literally the target of Russia's aggression. Poland is sending armored vehicles. Sweden is donating infantry fighting vehicles. Italy is giving artillery. Denmark and Estonia are sending howitzers. Latvia is providing more Stinger missiles.
Damn.
Lithuania is providing anti-aircraft guns.
Damn, he's spitting.
Finland recently announced its largest package of security assistance to date. You may remember I was asked a while ago what I think was going to happen. And I said, I let Putin know. He thought that he's going to end up with the Finlandization of Europe. Well, he's got the NATOization of Finland.
Jesus Christ.
Never intended.
Oh, my God.
Together with our allies and partners, we've sent more than 3,000 armored vehicles, more than 8,000 artillery systems, more than 2 million rounds of artillery ammunition, and more than 50 advanced multi-launch rocket systems, anti-ship and air defense systems, all to help counter Ukraine's brutal aggression that's happening because of Russia.
There's Biden fumble. Okay, yeah, he has to have one fumble per speech. One fumble per speech. Freudian slip. Secret Putin plant. Replaced Biden.
And look, today's announcement builds on the hard work and commitment from countries around the world, led by the United States of America, to help Ukraine defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. That's what this is about. Helping Ukraine defend and protect Ukrainian land. It is not an offensive threat to Russia.
That's true.
There's no offensive threat to Russia. If Russian troops return to Russia, they'll be there where they belong. This war would be over today.
That is true.
That's what we all want, an end to this war in just and lasting terms. You know, our teams...
Okay, I think you got enough of this speech. I think we get the idea, okay? He got his gaffe. I got to give you guys one Biden gaffe, so I'm giving fair coverage, right? For the conservatives in my audience, of course. MG referenced the musical. Thank you so much for the prime being sub for 4 months. We got Kevels in chat. Dylan is low-key cute as hell. Well, damn. You know, it's actually not my birthday, it's Zelensky's birthday, okay? So if anybody deserves to be called cute today, it's Zelensky. But I will take your compliment and I will take it. You've made this terrible pro-Western warmongering scoundrel CIA agent, and you've made him you've flattered him very much. Thank you, Keffels. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Burns is an
immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Chloe Siddick thinks about the prime and the 11 months. I saw Keffels had a run-in with Bad Empanada, and Bad Empanada doesn't like Keffels. And I gotta say, this is the thing with a Bad Empanada. He's like a litmus test. If Bad Empanada doesn't like you, then you're probably a decent person. And that's the thing. It's like, it's not always the perfect fit, litmus test, but if he doesn't like you, that means you're probably at least not actual scum,
Burns
right?
Is an immoral,
because that guy is like the perfect litmus test on everybody. Son of a God, thank you for gifting a tier 1 sub to Keffels. Keffels is now a sub in the evil imperialist Dylan Burns' chat. That will truly get her canceled and dragged through the dirt now. Dragged through the dirt. By the way, I don't know if you guys saw this, but Keffels was having some like late night thoughts about article I posted. I posted this article, which is, again, we're off topic. I don't know if Danabo's gonna edit this out or he's gonna keep it in to show how much of a streaming klutz I am. But this is a article published by Vice about the raid on the cartels in Mexico that I was reading, and then I stumbled upon this right here. A high caliber bullet poked out of one of the gates outside Guzman's house. Look at the bullet. Do you guys see the problem with this bullet? Do you guys see the problem? Still has the shell on it. Now, I don't know if somebody placed it there afterwards or what happened, but I feel like there should have been more clarification given.
Anglo Cossack a tier 1 subscription.
Like
semicolon.
Thanks, Makuzia, for poking the bear, as it were. Well, the thing, this is like a bullet. It's like the actual part of the bullet, and this is like an assault bullet. This is like when people says AR means assault rifle. Anyway, Keffel saw this and she responded, "I know I need to log off for the rest of the night because I scrolled past this and thought it was a let's just say a toy someone stuck to the wall. I want to keep my YouTube monetization." Anyway, Keffels let the intrusive thoughts take her over. Where were we? Oh yes, we're done with the speech. Okay, we're done with the speech. But I also want to say he wasn't the only person who had to answer questions, and I don't think we need to go through this, or we'll go through it after we're done with the segment. But Olaf Scholz also went out before the elected members of his government, and he of the government of Germany, and he explained why he made the decision to approve Leopard 2 shipments to Ukraine. There are people in the German government, particularly if you're part of the AfD, which is a German far-right party, which has had its own members go to the Donbass to support the Russian invasion, to support the annexation of territory, and has just been very generally isolationist party. They're very against sending Leopard tanks, and also the party that translates literally just into the left, which is like a hardcore like communist party. It kind of descends from, you know, a lot of like East Germany. Like, I don't want to get into specifics, but a lot of their members are against it. Generally, everyone else is in favor, like generally. But I do want to say that he did meet some opposition, and there is somewhat of a political risk here, since Germany is breaking from a lot of its political traditions since World War II when it comes to militarization, when it comes to shipping weapons, and when it comes to just aid shipments to Ukraine. This is a breaking with a lot of tradition, so Scholz had to answer these questions before his parliament. And it's a really interesting segment. We're going to watch it after we're finished covering this. Or you can go watch it yourself. But I also want to talk about the Kremlin, because the thing is, these tanks are going to have a measurable impact on the battlefield. When you look at Zaporozhye, right, and I'm not going to play the map type song for copyright reasons, maybe afterwards, but if you look at the area that if you look at the area that they want to launch an offensive, right, or where everyone wants to launch an offensive, but especially the Ukrainians, it's right here. I've been here. I went to a forward operating position, the front line here in Zaporozhye. You're going to need armored vehicles, a armored tip of the spear, if you want to conduct a operation to reclaim Metropole, to reclaim Mariupol, to reclaim any of this land. You're going to need it because these are large, flat plains with not a lot of cover. And so if you're going to be able to move from one trench to another trench that might be like a mile away or half a mile away, you're going to need an armored tip of the spear in front of your troops to provide them cover and to break through the line. You're going to need T-72 tanks. You're going to need T-62 tanks. You're going to need these Leopards. You're going to need these Abrams. You're going to need the armored fighting vehicles. You're going to need everything you can to act as the armored tip of the spear pushing into this territory. That's what they had to use in order to have a successful operation in Kherson, in order to reclaim it and take back the only provincial capital that the Russians have captured so far. And this is giving Ukraine more flexibility to conduct more counteroffensives in the future, even it's going into the long term. And they'll be able to use these armored vehicles to hopefully stop a future, most likely planned Russian counteroffensive, which who knows, not really counteroffensive, they are conducting an offensive, but a Russian offensive that many people are predicting is going to happen in the spring. So these are really a game changer, not necessarily even because of this specific shipment, even though this shipment is going to be helpful, but because of the shipments that come after these troops are trained on Leopards, know how to repair Leopards, trained on Abrams, know how to repair Abrams, and we got 2,000 Abram tanks throughout Europe, and more that could possibly be made. And so there's a high cap on the amount of tanks that could be sent potentially. This all depends on political will. And I've said this since the start of this war. Whether the Ukrainians win or not is not even necessarily dependent upon the will of the Ukrainian people. That is solid. That is steadfast. That is a nation that no matter what wants to draw its lines, the lines of its borders covering all of its internationally recognized territory. Kherson, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, everything. They are determined to win. From the most influential rich Ukrainian to the poorest Ukrainian who is living in a $200 to $100 like cheap apartment, like they are in this till victory, right? The thing that is really going to tell whether they win or not is how much the West is willing to produce the artillery shells necessary for them to win, whether they're willing to send the tanks that are necessary to win, and whether they're willing to push this war through till the end. That is whether that's the main determining factor on whether Ukraine's going to get back Donetsk, whether they're going to get back Luhansk, or whether they're going to have to settle to giving thousands of square kilometers of land to the Russians, which they will abuse and they will torture the people on, and they will continue these policies of filling mass graves on this territory as they've done so far. And as the Ukrainian counteroffensives have liberated more villages, like in Izium, we've uncovered the largest mass grave uncovered in Europe since the Yugoslav genocides, over 440 bodies. We're not even talking about Bucha, but we have more and more of these crimes being uncovered. And these Ukrainians are determined to liberate those people. It is not Ukrainian determination or Ukrainian will to fight that necessarily determine whether this war is successful or not. If they win an outright victory, have to swallow a bitter stalemate or ceasefire or whatever. It is whether the West is willing to see them go with them till victory. That is what's going to determine it. Anyway, I want to hear how the Russians have responded to this big W for the Ukrainians. What do they think of the fact that they're going to now have to face Western tanks? They're facing Western artillery, Western tanks, Western aid, all this stuff that is improving in quality as the Russians are trying to win by quantity. And they're losing a lot of men doing it as they send Wagner prisoners, people who they rapists, murderers that they grabbed from prison, gave a machine gun and said charge, using them as cannon fodder. Do they think that they can do that to beat the Abrams, to beat the Leopards, to beat all this new aid that is being sent to Ukraine? What are they saying about this aid? Are they getting nervous or are they just getting angry? Well, I think a little bit of both. Let's watch.
Breaking news moments ago, a major development in the war in Ukraine after weeks of pressure from Western allies. Germany announcing this morning it will send those Leopard 2 tanks to the war zone, joining the United States in doing so. Our Fred Pleikton joins us live in eastern Ukraine. Look, this is huge news, right? And very welcome news for Volodymyr Zelensky and all of Ukraine.
Yeah, it certainly is. And you already heard yesterday when it sort of was seeping through that this was probably going to happen, that the Ukrainians certainly are very happy. We just got some details from the Germans. They say that their main goal is to create, in the end, 2 tank battalions that the Ukrainians are supposed to get. That would be about 88 of these Leopard 2 main battle tanks. However, they also say that in a first step right now, they're going to send 14 of these tanks as fast as possible. The Germans also say they want the training for the Ukrainians to start as fast as possible. There was one interesting nuance that we got, Poppy, from the Germans as well. They're saying that they are going to give permission to other European countries that own these tanks to also send these Leopard 2 main battle tanks to the Ukrainians as well. That means the Ukrainians could get a lot of these tanks very quickly because a lot of European nations have these tanks. Now, of course, we know that all this came after some pretty tough negotiations between the Germans and the United States. In the end, the United States apparently relenting to also sending Abrams main battle tanks to Ukraine as well. Of course, the Ukrainians pretty happy to be getting.
I never thought they were going to do that. I never thought we were actually going to send the Abrams. Can I just emphasize, the Abrams felt like a distant possibility, and we have gotten literally the best case scenario happening right now for the Ukrainians. This is best case scenario. Leopards, Abrams, other armored vehicles, training on repair crews, repair vehicle, like this is best case scenario. Now it's just we need to follow up on this. Continue to send more, make it a steady stream of equipment. Make sure that we keep the pressure.
Tanks, both of German make and of American make in the not too distant future as well, guys.
And Fred, there's been quite the response this morning from Russia, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I was actually messaging with.
By the way, you saw the grin that went on that reporter's face. He has to be unbiased, but you saw that little smirk he got there, because even he knows, like, ah, man. Well, yes, we're reporting to the Kremlin right now. We're looking out, and I can report that live right now. The Kremlin seems to be coping. And I do see a decent amount of seething as well. I'll get back to you as the situation changes. I doubt it will, Laura.
Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I was actually messaging with the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, a little while ago. And first of all, he was saying that obviously the Russians say that this will increase the tension here on the continent. He says that suffering will increase for the Ukrainians as well. He wrote that in a message to me, but really some strong words coming from the Russian ambassador to the United States. And he came out and he said that Abrams tanks that enter Ukraine will be destroyed by the Russians. Of course, the Russians so far have said that about pretty much every new weapon system that the U.S. and its allies have sent. So far, none of that has happened. And again,
can I say that the Russians keep saying they just keep destroying HIMARS? They have yet to publish any footage or real evidence that shows them destroying HIMARS, which is a high-range multiple rocket system that has been used by the Ukrainians to really tear apart Russian logistics, has really blunted the Russian offensives. And they keep saying they keep destroying them, but they don't publish any evidence. But somebody did the numbers on the amount of HIMARS they have claimed to have destroyed, that people like Gonzalo Lira and others have like reiterated have been destroyed. And they have destroyed over, according to the Kremlin, over 230% of the HIMARS sent to Ukraine, because they've said they've destroyed more HIMARS than than the amount we've actually sent. Destroyed double than the amount we actually sent there. Still haven't presented a single piece of evidence that they destroyed even one that could be substantiated.
And the Ukrainians really very, very happy with these decisions. Really believe they're going to get a lot more tanks than they had originally thought, guys.
All ahead of what is expected.
Yeah, I honestly, I think the Ukrainians are probably even surprised at the amount of tanks that they're getting. Unironically, this was like a big surprise. I do want to move on, of course, to Russian state TV, because we got our favorite Russian propagandist. Everybody here loves him. Solenyev. He's the guy on TV always railing against those dastardly Ukrainians. What have they done today? And he is very upset about Germany sending the Leopard tanks to Ukraine. He hasn't taken it very well. I'm going to read the subtitles. I'll play the audio, play the footage. He's not happy, to say the least. He is not happy. I think it's time to send a clear, resolute message that we consider Germany a party to the conflict, and that German tanks appearing in Ukraine will definitely lead us, to considering German territory, military bases, and other sites to be legitimate targets. NATO wants to fight in this cunning way, pretending that it's not fighting in your dreams. In your dreams. And Pistorius will go down in history as a cretin who led Germany ending up as a zone of direct destruction. And Schultz too. And Baerbock. And the German people will know which new Nazi leaders they raised and brought to power. That's my subjective opinion. Where's the aggressor? For 8 years, you bastards have neutered the Nazi Ukrainian regime. For 8 years, you've been killing the people of the Donbass. For 8 years, you've been lying to the mouth of your mutterer Merkel. For 8 years, you've been lying. You didn't see the tragedy of the Donbass, the murdered children of the Donbass, but what are you posing as of now? You European Pharisees, you Nazi scumbags. I do want to say that recently, can I say all the nations that he has accused of being a Nazi state in the last week? He has accused Ukraine, of course, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, and Germany. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Ukraine, and Germany. All Nazi states. Crazy, isn't it? It's crazy that all these countries, all at the same time, who all just so happen to disagree with Russia's foreign policy, also so happen to be the most demonized, good demonized, by the way. Nazis should be demonized because they're evil. The most demonized, most hated ideology of all Slavs everywhere. Just so happens to be Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Moldovans, Germans and Ukrainians. The governments on the other side of the aisle just so happen to be a Nazi regime. Man, it's very convenient for them, isn't it? Very convenient propaganda-wise. They all just so happen to be Nazis. But they're angry. They're angry because they know that their equipment, a lot of their tanks and storage are not top-tier tanks. They're not top-tier tanks. They're not like top of the aisle, the best. A lot of them have been tanks in storage where their guns have been damaged or their quality has gone down, or they're just like old tanks. And so when they see these new Western tanks flooding into the country, when Ukraine needs armor, if it's going to launch a counteroffensive or stop a prospective Russian counteroffensive, which people are expecting in spring, they're going to need this equipment. And they're getting more than I think most people, even the Russians, expected. Solenev's angry because he, along with other propagandists, were probably told something along the line, and he led into this, that the Germans are going to freeze. The Ukrainians are going to freeze. The Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Romanians, Moldovans, everybody in Europe is going to freeze. The French, all of them, they're going to freeze. The UK is going to freeze. They're going to feel the strangle of the economy. And then this time next year, we're going to be Gucci, and we're going to win the war, and they're going to have to give us all this territory, and Ukraine's going to have to give up all their weapons, and they're going to have to become our proxy state. But that's not how it went out. That's not how it played out. That plan didn't work. And now the Russians are almost a year into the war, and they've achieved none of their original military objectives. They haven't captured all of the Donbass, which they claimed they wanted to do. They have not demilitarized Ukraine. Ukraine's more militarized than ever, with Abrams tanks, top-of-the-line tanks being shipped into the country, Leopards being shipped into the country. They have HIMARS. They have Patriot air defense systems. Ukraine is more militarized than ever, so that has failed. They wanted to stop the expansion of NATO, while Finland and Sweden are literally at the door of NATO, banging on it with fury, trying to get into NATO. They haven't achieved any of their original military objectives. They haven't overthrown the Zelensky regime. So their quote-unquote denazification, which again, war has nothing to do with Nazism. It's just a propaganda line, not on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. It's a war of Russian nationalism. That's what it is. Russian conquest. And they're trying to use it as a cover to scare Westerners and say, evil Nazis. That's the plan. But that hasn't worked either. They didn't change the government in Ukraine. None of their objectives have won. They haven't regained Russia's glory on the international stage and its prestige and reasserted itself as a superpower. Russia's image is irreparably damaged for decades to come as a military power. You see other nations like Kazakhstan starting to somewhat break rank as they send generators to Ukraine as aid. You see Armenia, which relies on Russian support and Russian troops in order to stop Azerbaijan from cracking down on Karabakh, which they are doing right now. We saw Azerbaijani soldiers shooting at FSB agents in Armenia. The Armenians are looking to the Americans thinking, maybe we should listen to the Americans. Maybe we should talk to them about defending us. They're looking for other options. You see a lot of powers that were going to buy Russian military equipment. Either the equipment they did buy, they're giving to the Ukrainians, like Morocco, who bought tanks off of Belarus. Those tanks are now being sent to Ukraine. Others are no longer interested because they're like, wow, is this the equipment that we thought was gonna, it's cheap and that's why we're going to buy it, but we also told it was good. Well, now we know why this equipment is so cheap in comparison to American equipment, because apparently it wasn't enough to win. It's not enough to win this war. And again, Russia has an interconnected highway system. It's not like Operation Iraqi Freedom, where they're conducting an invasion halfway across the world, which is a logistical mess, by the way. They're invading a nation that has an interconnected highway system with them. Can't win. Can't win. It's wild, man. It's absolutely wild. And so it's not that surprising that the Russians are pissed, but I'm honestly surprised by the amount of support Biden is giving Ukraine right now. Pleasantly surprised, by the way. If I was in his position, I would do the same thing. And I'm happy that the Germans have finally caved on this and are going to allow the swarm of leopards into Ukraine to win the war. And this is all while, and I haven't discussed this on the stream yet, that the Biden administration is warming more and more and more to the idea of strikes in Crimea by the Ukrainian military. Maybe even attempts to take it back. Because they've seen how poorly the Russians have performed and how a lot of these like Russian nuclear threats have basically turned into nothing. And the Russian narrative on nuclear threats have kind of become more milquetoast as other nations that they rely on to not accept, you know, price caps like India and China have not taken well to those nuclear threats. And there's even information that's been made public that the Chinese government has been talking to Russian generals in a deal with the United States to convince them that in a proposed nuclear strike, if Putin was to give the order, that they disobey Putin's orders. Wild forms of diplomacy happening around in the back room. This has probably given the Biden administration enough confidence to say, if the Russians were to use a nuke, it would not be an advantage whatsoever. It would isolate them diplomatically. The possible radiological spillover would be a disaster. Probably would not make the Ukrainians give up if the freezing cold won it. I think if there's any nation on earth that has taken a thubbing, like a really pounding when it comes to radiation, it is the Ukrainians. I think if they understand that risk and they're still willing to continue fighting, that shows their willpower. It would lead to more military aid to Ukraine, more financial aid to Ukraine. That threat is kind of falling off the table. The threat is a lot more useful to the Russians than actually using them. And so the Americans have gotten more confident. And I think rightfully so, the Americans have gotten more confident. I don't think we should like put our troops on the ground or anything, but I do think we should give Ukraine the go-ahead to conduct strikes in Crimea. And I think the biggest piece of evidence when it comes to Crimea is that the Ukrainians already have struck Crimea and nothing happened. The only thing that happened is the continuous Russian terror campaign against civilians, like with the strike they did in Dnipro that killed all the civilians. Or what we saw in Bucha and everywhere else. The continued air campaign, the campaign of terror. But that was already happening in the first place. We could see that with the Kerch Bridge explosion or the strikes on air bases in Crimea. Nothing happened. And we were told that the world would explode if Russia was to lose or have their territory that they've claimed in the last 9 years. They only captured Crimea in the last 9 years. But if Ukraine was to even touch it, the world would explode. Didn't have it 9 years ago, but if Ukraine, who rightfully under international law and by the UN votes and all that owns Crimea, if they didn't even touch it, the world would explode. These doomsday profiteers are losing more and more influence because we're all seeing the world still around us. The Russian rhetoric on this hasn't escalated to an insane degree. It's actually died down because they realize that using a nuke would not benefit them. And it looks like there's not going to be a nuclear strike. It doesn't look like it's a really large threat. And so we're warming to these ideas. The Russians are in a very difficult position right now where they straight up just have to, like, they're not going to be able to use nuclear threats to get out of this. They're not going to be able to pressure the West economically to get out of this. They have to, if they want to get out of this on the good side of it, they have to either straight up win or cut their losses and get out of there. And victory is going to be very hard for them to achieve when the biggest thing they can brag about right now is capturing a city of 10,000 people called Soledar. If that's what they're bragging about when they need to capture cities of like 3 million people or 100,000 to 500,000 or a million plus people, and those are the larger goals they need to do. I mean, Kramatorsk is a fortress, and if it took them this long to capture Bakhmut, and they still haven't captured Bakhmut, by the way, then it's going to be very hard for them to capture Kramatorsk. I was at Kramatorsk. Place is a fucking fortress. Sorry, cursed YouTube. Please let me keep my money. Anyway, these shipments are a game changer. This is much more than I expected the Ukrainians to get, and I'm very happy about it, and I'm sure the Ukrainians are happy about it. We need to keep up the pressure and continue to send these tanks. Now, before we wrap up this segment, I do think I should respond, because I've gotten a few DMs from like conservative commentators saying, Dylan, why are you happy that these tanks are being sent? Like, the world is gonna explode, or oh my gosh, this escalation, yada yada. I wanna go through a few of these tweets, and then I'll talk about the idea of like, this is a terrible escalation. Oh my goodness. So let's go through a few. First, Michael Tracy. Can't help, and I already replied to these tweets because again, I'm a reply lord. Can't help but perversely appreciate whatever historical wormhole we followed into, where German tanks rolling across Europe for the first time since 1945 is seen as a big celebratory triumph. I mean, it is interesting as like a footnote, but let's be for real. A lot has happened in 80 years. The geopolitical situation is completely different, right? The just general domestic political situation is completely different. The war that's being fought is the biggest war since World War II right now. It's not that surprising that people are happy that the nation being invaded and having its people dumped into mass graves as their culture is erased and their art stolen in an attempt to erase Ukrainian culture and reclaim it as Russian. The cultural conquest, some would even say, and it's becoming more and more convincing argument to me, a sort of cultural genocide that's going on, and people say, oh yes, I am happy that the nation being invaded, being forcefully conquered, is getting the tools necessary to defend itself. Is that really that crazy that people are rooting for the underdog being invaded? Is that really that crazy? There's a reason why people rooted for Finland when the Soviets invaded. Because they were the underdog being wrongfully invaded. Same with the Polish, not only during the first Soviet invasion, but the second invasion as well, when the Nazis and the Soviets coordinated an invasion of Poland, split it up. Soviets engaged in mass deportation, Nazis engaged in genocide. The straight up annihilation of the Polish people, cut their population 1/3. Of course I would have rooted for the Warsaw Uprising. Of course I would have rooted for the Polish against the Soviet invasion in the 1920s. Of course most people would, because they're rooting for the underdog that was wrongfully invaded. But it's not that surprising. Really? Is it that surprising? My goodness. Let's go to the next one. Let's just bump through these quickly. Congress is pathetic. They're completely inert, letting Biden unilaterally exercise extraordinary war powers with almost non-existent oversight. The one branch of government with sole authority to declare war is boldly proving its own utter uselessness and even under GOP control. And this is a response to our plan to send Abram tanks. So, number one, I don't know why Congress would exert the authority here to declare war when we're not declaring war on Russia. We're sending weapons to Ukraine. The Soviets did not declare war on us when they sent supplies to, say, the Viet Cong and North Vietnam, or sent supplies to any number of nations we ended up fighting a war with, because it wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't. That's the first thing. The second thing is, Congress isn't like an inert, like, oh, we're too scared of Biden to stand up to him on Ukraine. That's not what's happening. The vast majority of Congress supports sending weapons, financial, all types of aid to Ukraine, including these tanks. So why would Congress stop them if Congress, the vast majority of them, probably like 80 to 90% of people in Congress, support this? It doesn't really make any sense. Also, the majority of Americans support sending military aid to Ukraine. So this is elected leaders doing what the majority of their constituents want, and what they want on a personal, ideological, and sometimes even financial level. Why would Congress stop them? It isn't pathetic for Congress to not step in the way of something they support. It doesn't make any sense. I do think Congress should exert more authority when it comes to foreign policy. That's why I was so supportive of Nancy Pelosi's visit, and even supportive of Kevin McCarthy's soon-to-be visit to Taiwan. And I would be more supportive of them talking about the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force when it comes to terrorism. That's something that I think Congress needs to have an active discussion over. This, I support it, Congress supports it, and the majority of Americans support it, and the Biden administration supports it. Makes no sense for them to block it. I don't understand this. And one more from Michael Tracy, just for good luck, you know? Just wanna have good luck, I guess. We should do one more. Here it is. Everyone must be sleeping soundly tonight, safe in the knowledge that Germany has been successfully berated into repudiating its policy of avoiding rather than pursuing aggressive militarization. Let's be clear. Germany did everything they could to avoid sending the Leopards to Ukraine, really. They did everything they could. It's 11 months into the war. They generally had a policy of reconciliation when it comes to the Russian government. They wanted to intertwine European and Russian economy and the energy markets, and they built pipelines to do so. Merkel was heavily involved in this policy. They have done basically everything they could have to reconcile and have a good, friendly relationship with the Russian government and to avoid quote-unquote escalating, if you want to use that word, or rapid militarization. They don't even meet the 2% NATO defense spending standard, which is like the minimum you're supposed to hit. They don't hit it even 11 months into the war. When we talk about the aggressive militarization of Germany in response to an act of war, there are times when militarization, when it comes to sending weapons and building weapons to be sent, is actually appropriate. Not to just fill the pockets of the military-industrial complex, but when there's a war going on. If there's a war going on, and it's a war that has a moral right to be fought, like the defensive war against the Russian imperialist aggressive invasion, then why would I be angry that they're sending weapons or this is militarizing in any way? This would be like saying, oh, can you believe it, Dylan? And it's 1942 and the United States is militarizing. Well, of course we're militarizing. We got a war to fight. And in this instance, we're not even fighting a war directly. We're just sending weapons. But so far, that's too much militarization as well. That's way too much. Come on, get out of here. And lastly, let's talk about the idea of escalation, that this is going to escalate. The Russian response to this is basically, we're going to destroy your tanks, which they say for every single weapon sent over, right? Including the HIMARS, which they've claimed they destroyed all of them twice, and they have yet to provide any evidence of. But Russia invaded. How can you escalate higher than that? There is nothing the West can do outside of directly invading Russia or directly putting their troops in the war, hand to hand, like battalion after battalion, to fight it themselves. That would be an escalation from the West. They invaded Ukraine in an attempt to completely conquer it, annex vast swaths of territory, erase Ukrainian culture, and a war would have now become almost like a war of annihilation of Ukrainian culture, of Ukrainian national identity. And us sending them the tools necessary to stop that war is not, that's an escalation. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's like if somebody's getting stabbed and you quote unquote escalated it by giving them a knife to defend themselves. Is it an escalation, or are we just giving what we're receiving? Doesn't make any sense to me. Doesn't make any sense for me whatsoever. And anybody saying, oh, this brings us closer to nuclear Armageddon, I'm sorry. If you think Russia's going to nuke Ukraine because we sent them tanks, then, I mean, you have an even more radical position of what the Russians are going to do than the Russians themselves. And let me also say, and I can't believe I didn't say this earlier, Russian state TV talking about destroying Germany itself, attacking German territory, that's an escalation. That is an escalation in rhetoric. Well, they've actually talked about stuff like this for a while, but that would be an actual escalation, and they're openly floating that. There isn't any talk in DC of, oh, we're going to bomb Moscow, everybody. We're going to go nuke Moscow. You might hear the odd politician here or there talk about, oh, maybe, you know, future without Putin. But there isn't like, oh, we're going to go bomb Moscow. You don't hear from Olaf Scholz that we're going to drop paratroopers into Moscow and we're going to take the city. That is an escalation in rhetoric. That's what I would consider an actual escalation of the war to be. Not sending tanks that they need to defend themselves. And even if I was to give that this is an escalation, we're just escalating to not even half of what the Russians have done in this war. Not even half. We're just meeting what they give out. You know, where if this is a game of tennis, the Russians hit super hard and we lightly bunted it back, and now the Russians are complaining that we hit it too hard. It's pathetic. Anyway, that's enough of this. I'm happy that the Ukrainians are getting these tanks. This is a game changer, and we got to make sure that the flow of tanks continues if they want to get back the territory that is rightfully theirs. Good luck to the Ukrainian tank crews that are going to be operating these tanks against Russian soldiers for the first time in the history of warfare. Pretty crazy stuff.